What happens when a man who has spent his life forging iron is finally forced to watch his own flesh broken beyond repair? The hammer that once served his master begins to whisper another purpose. The forge of Nathaniel, the enslaved blacksmith of Briarwood Plantation in Georgia, was alive before the roosters cried. The air still held the night's chill, but in the smithy the fire already glowed red, coals crackling as if impatient for his hands. The man was built like the anvils he struck, broad-shouldered, skin darkened, not only by birth but by years of smoke and soot. His palms were hardened leather, his back carved with scars that he no longer counted. Yet despite all this, he was known among the quarters for gentleness. He fixed the children's broken shoes when overseers weren't looking, repaired women's pots with quiet skill, and once risked a beating by secretly reforging a bent hoe so that an old man could work without his hands trembling from the strain. Those who passed by his shed often saw him humming, not hymns from the white man's church, but rhythms from an older time, beats remembered from a mother stolen when he was a child. That morning, however, he was not humming. At his side stood Clara, his younger sister, balancing a bucket of water for the forge. She was no more than 19, with skin smooth despite the fields, and eyes that carried both mischief and defiance. She had not yet been broken into silence like so many others. "Brother," she whispered, glancing around to ensure no overseer lurked nearby. "They sent word. You'll be mending Master Henry's horse tack today." Nathaniel grunted, hammer falling rhythmically against iron. "Then I'll mend it. What else can I do?" Clara's lips pressed tight. "He's been drinking since last night. You know what that means." What it meant was danger. Henry Wallace, son of the plantation's owner and heir to Briarwood, was notorious not just for cruelty but for his moods. A whip when sober, a pistol when drunk. Nathaniel knew it, but he also knew refusal was impossible. He only struck harder at the iron, sparks flying. Perspective. Clara. She never trusted silence. On a plantation, silence was like the pause before a storm. The fields might look calm, overseers might lean lazy against their saddles, but she had lived long enough to know that violence could spring from quiet as easily as from rage. Her brother was the only steady thing in that chaos. He bent iron, but not his will. When she was little, he carried her on his shoulders to the well, whispering stories about their mother's homeland, a place of rivers and drums where no one called them property. In the darkest nights, when the lash cracked outside, she would hold his hand and believe him. But even Nathaniel could not protect her from Henry Wallace. She remembered the first time Henry's pale eyes landed on her like knives. She had been 12, sweeping the veranda, when he pinched her cheek and muttered that she would be ripe soon. She told Nathaniel that night, and he nearly marched to the big house, fists clenched, until an older slave pulled him back and whispered, "Die for that, and she'll still be here tomorrow." Now, 7 years later, Henry's eyes lingered longer, his words fouler. Clara's heart quickened at the thought of him summoning Nathaniel. Something was brewing, and not just in the forge. Perspective. Henry Wallace. To Henry the world was simple. He was white, wealthy, and heir to hundreds of acres of land that stretched farther than his horse could gallop. Everything within it, from the cotton to the bodies that bent to pick it, belonged to him by birthright. That belief sat in his bones like marrow. The son of Master Wallace, he had grown up with a silver goblet in one hand and a whip in the other. His cousins, Edward and Charles, often visited from neighboring plantations. Together they hunted deer in the swamps, drank themselves sick, and competed in cruelties. To them, slaves were toys, flesh to be broken when boredom struck. This morning Henry's head throbbed from whiskey, but he welcomed it. It gave him an excuse for temper, and temper gave him power. The tack on his stallion had split yesterday, and though it was a small matter, he decided it was the perfect excuse to drag the blacksmith from his shed. The man's quiet eyes always unsettled him. Too steady, too knowing. Henry preferred fear, so he sent word. Perspective. Nathaniel. By midday, Nathaniel carried the tack across the yard, Clara trailing behind him with the repaired straps coiled neatly. The sun blazed hot, burning the skin, even through sweat. White columns of the big house gleamed in mockery, while the quarters sagged behind, roofs patched with straw. At the stable, Henry waited with his cousins Edward and Charles, all three reeking of brandy. Laughter spilled from their mouths, not from joy, but from the cruel amusement that came from seeing others bow. "Here he is," Henry drawled, tossing an empty bottle into the straw. "Our blacksmith saint. Thought you'd never crawl out of that hole of yours." Nathaniel bowed his head slightly, handing over the mended tack without words. Silence was safer than speech, but Clara's presence caught Henry's eye. He leaned against the stall, lips curling. "And who do we have here?" "Little Clara. My, you've grown." Edward chuckled. Henry, don't tell me you've been saving her for yourself. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. His hands, rough from years of iron, curled into fists. He did not move, but the air around him seemed to darken, as if the forge fire had followed him. Henry stepped closer to Clara, fingers reaching for her chin. Pretty thing, isn't she? Shame to waste her carrying buckets when she could be. The words hung in the air like poison. Clara stiffened, her eyes flashing toward her brother. Nathaniel's breath came heavy. His entire life had been bound by chains, but at that moment the chains felt thinner than they ever had. The tension in the stable swelled. Horses stamped nervously, sensing the storm. Edward lit another cigar, chuckling at the spectacle. Charles leaned against the rail, muttering something about teaching them their place. Inside Nathaniel, however, the hammer had struck its last blow. It was supposed to be another day of humiliation, another moment swallowed in silence. But when laughter turned to hands reaching where they did not belong, the forge inside Nathaniel cracked wide. Perspective. Clara. The stable smelled of sweat and hay. But all Clara noticed was Henry's hand. His fingers, pale and rough from the rains, tilted her chin upward as if she were a piece of cattle at auction. She froze. Every fiber in her body screamed to slap it away, but the memory of lashes bit her tongue. She glanced sideways at Nathaniel, her only anchor. Henry's cousins laughed like hyenas circling prey. Edward spat tobacco into the straw, grinning. Go on, Henry. Show us what the Wallaces keep in their barns. Shame and fear twisted in Clara's stomach, but above all there was rage. It was the same rage she had felt since she was 12, since the first time Henry whispered filth into her ear. And yet she stood still, because stillness was survival. But when Henry leaned closer, his lips brushing against her cheek as if to claim what was never his, she heard the sharp exhale from her brother's chest. Perspective. Nathaniel, his whole life had been forged around control. Control of heat, control of hammer, control of anger when overseers mocked him. But control had its limits. When Henry touched Clara, something inside Nathaniel snapped like brittle iron. He stepped forward, his voice low but edged like steel. Take your hand off her. The stable went silent. Even the horses seemed to pause, ears flicking at the sudden weight in the air. Edward burst into laughter. The blacksmith talks now. He slapped his knee, looking at Charles. Hear that? The mule thinks he's a man. Henry did not laugh. His hand slid from Clara's chin, but his eyes turned sharp, drunk fury boiling behind them. What did you say to me, boy? Nathaniel didn't flinch. You heard me. The cousins exchanged glances, the kind that promised trouble. Charles pushed off the rail, reaching for the riding crop at his belt. Henry's face reddened, half from whiskey, half from the audacity of being challenged. You forget yourself, he hissed, stepping chest to chest with Nathaniel. He smelled of liquor and arrogance. You think because you swing a hammer, you're something more than property. I'll remind you what you are. Perspective. Henry Wallace. Henry felt heat rush to his face, not just from drink but from insult. Slaves did not speak back. Not to him, not in front of his cousins. If he let this go, whispers would spread through the quarters. He could not allow that. He reached for the pistol tucked into his waistband, not to shoot, not yet, but to show dominance. A glint of metal flashed in the dim stable light. You want to play at being a man, Henry sneered. Let's see how long that lasts. Perspective. Clara. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. The sight of the pistol made her breath hitch, but more than fear, she felt a cold clarity. Henry was drunk, reckless, and dangerous. One wrong move and her brother would be left bleeding in the straw. She grabbed Nathaniel's arm, whispering desperately, "Please don't." But Nathaniel's eyes were no longer the eyes of the patient blacksmith. They burned like the forge at full fire. Perspective. Nathaniel. The moment Henry drew the pistol, Nathaniel knew the rules of survival were gone. He had endured beatings, chains, humiliation, but this was his sister. His hand shot forward with the speed of a hammer's strike. Before Henry could level the pistol, Nathaniel's fist collided with his jaw. The crack echoed in the stable louder than any whip. Henry stumbled backward, the gun clattering to the ground. The cousins shouted in shock. Edward lunged, swinging his cigar like a weapon, but Nathaniel shoved him aside with one arm. Charles whipped his crop across Nathaniel's back, splitting skin, but the blacksmith barely flinched. Years of scars had made his body an armor of pain. The stable erupted into chaos. Horses reared, hooves striking the stalls. Clara scrambled to kick the pistol under the straw. Out of reach, Henry, dazed but furious, spat blood onto the ground. "You'll hang for this," he roared, reaching for a pitchfork leaning nearby. But Nathaniel had already seized the heavy iron shoeing hammer resting on the bench. Its weight was familiar, comforting, as natural to him as breath. He raised it, his chest heaving, his gaze fixed not on the weapon but on the faces of the men who had stolen every shred of peace from their lives. What happens when laughter curdles into terror? when the whip and the pistol no longer command silence, but spark a storm that no overseer can contain. The stable became a furnace, and every strike was a reckoning. Perspective, Nathaniel. The hammer felt alive in his hand. Its head glistened with sweat and straw dust, heavy as judgment. For years it had been his tool of survival, reshaping iron to serve others, forging horseshoes, hinges, chains. Now it trembled with another purpose. Henry snarled, staggering upright with the pitchfork gripped in white-knuckled rage. "You'll pay with your skin, black dog." His voice cracked, but the venom in it was sharp enough to cut. Edward charged first, perhaps thinking his bulk and drunken bravado could overpower the blacksmith. Nathaniel swung wide. The hammer caught Edward across the temple with a sound like iron splitting oak. The cousin collapsed into the straw, limbs twitching. The stable exploded with screams. Horses reared against their stalls, their eyes rolling white, hooves smashing wood. Clara shrieked and scrambled backward into the corner, her hands clawing at the dirt to keep from being trampled. Charles darted in with the riding crop. The leather whip coiled around Nathaniel's shoulder, tearing flesh, but pain had lost its meaning. With his free hand, Nathaniel yanked the crop and pulled Charles forward, smashing the hammer into his ribs. A wet crack, then silence, as Charles crumpled beside Edward. Now only Henry stood. Perspective. Clara. Her body shook so violently she thought her bones might snap. The sight of Edward's head bent at an unnatural angle, Charles coughing blood into the hay. This was no dream, no whispered story from the quarters. This was happening in front of her. Her brother. Her quiet brother. The man who once carved toys from wood scraps for the children, stood like a giant of fire and fury. She wanted to scream for him to stop, but the words lodged in her throat. A small voice inside her, a voice she had buried since childhood, whispered, "They deserve this." Still, fear strangled her. She knew what came for slaves who raised a hand to their masters. She had seen the tree by the road, the one that bore more than fruit. Her heart begged for Nathaniel to run, to vanish into the woods. Yet her eyes could not look away from the hammer dripping with what could never be undone. Perspective. Henry Wallace. Henry's chest heaved. Sweat stung his eyes. Rage burned his veins. But beneath it all, a creeping sensation curled in his gut. Fear. For the first time in his life, he was not the predator but the prey. He lunged with the pitchfork, aiming for Nathaniel's chest. The blacksmith twisted, the iron prongs grazing his side and tearing his shirt. Pain seared, but Nathaniel closed in, using the hammer to knock the pitchfork aside. Sparks flew as metal struck metal. Henry's hands shook. He had hunted deer, fox, even men, but none of them had ever stared at him like this. Unyielding, merciless, alive with centuries of chained fury. "You think you can kill me?" Henry spat, though his voice cracked with doubt. "You think this changes anything? You'll still die a slave." Perspective. Nathaniel. The word struck deeper than the wound. Slave. Always that word, thrown like chains. Nathaniel's vision blurred with rage. He thought of Clara's frightened eyes, of their mother's screams long buried in memory, of every lash, every scar, every stolen moment of peace. He swung. The hammer struck Henry's shoulder, crunching bone. The master cried out, staggering back, blood spraying across the whitewashed wall of the stall. But Nathaniel did not stop. He struck again, driving Henry to the ground. The pitchfork clattered useless to the dirt. Henry raised a trembling hand, his voice breaking. "Wait!" But the blacksmith who had bent iron his whole life did not wait. The hammer fell one final time, and silence swallowed the stable. Perspective. Clara. The air smelled of blood and smoke from the forge that still clung to Nathaniel's clothes. The straw was slick beneath her hands. Her ears rang with the echo of blows, though the stable was quiet now except for the restless snorts of the horses. She crawled toward her brother, her body trembling. He stood still, chest heaving, the hammer dangling at his side like a relic. His eyes were not wild but steady, almost calm. That frightened her most of all. "Nathaniel," she whispered, touching his arm. His skin was hot, slick with sweat. He turned slowly, meeting her gaze. For a moment she thought she saw the brother she had always known, the protector, the gentle giant. But behind his eyes burned something deeper, something unshackled. She wanted to ask, "What have you done?" But she already knew. The question was not what, but what would follow. Perspective. Nathaniel. The weight of the hammer pulled at his arm, but it was not heavier than the years he had carried. He looked down at the three bodies, Edward twisted, Charles broken, Henry still. For the first time in his life, silence did not mean submission, it meant release. His side throbbed from the cut of the pitchfork. Blood seeped through his shirt, warm against his ribs, but pain felt distant, as though his body was only the forge and his spirit the fire inside it. He looked at Clara, her face pale with shock. He wanted to tell her it was over, that she was safe, but his throat tightened. Words felt too small for what had just been unleashed. Perspective, Clara. Outside the stable, voices stirred, the distant call of field hands, the bark of an overseer's dog. Time was running faster than her thoughts. She grabbed Nathaniel's wrist. "We can't stay here," she hissed, panic clawing her voice. "They'll come. They'll kill us both." But Nathaniel didn't move, his eyes fixed on the hammer, on the blood, on the fire that still roared in his chest. The stable doors creaked with the sound of someone approaching. The silence shattered again. When the doors of the stable groaned open, the night no longer belonged to masters and overseers. It belonged to the fire that had been smothered for centuries, and it burned in the eyes of the blacksmith. Perspective, Clara. The creak of the stable doors ripped her chest open with fear. Clara's hands were still damp with blood from the straw, and her legs shook so badly she thought they might give way. She yanked at Nathaniel's arm. "Hide it," she whispered, meaning the hammer. "Please, hide it." But Nathaniel did not move. He stood tall, chest heaving, weapon loose in his fist, the bodies of Henry and his cousins at his feet. The smell of death clung to the air like smoke after a fire. A figure stepped into the doorway, lantern raised. The light revealed Overseer Brant, his face shadowed beneath his wide-brimmed hat, his whip coiled at his hip. He squinted at the sight before him, eyes narrowing as the scene unfolded in the trembling lantern glow. For a moment, silence swallowed everything. Even the horses froze, as though the entire plantation held its breath. Perspective, Overseer Brant. Brant had seen blood before. He had spilled plenty himself, and he knew the sight of a fight gone too far. But this, 3 white men sprawled in the straw, their skulls split like melons, their fine coats soaked crimson. This was no accident. His hand went to the whip on instinct, but his gut twisted. He had always thought of Nathaniel as different, too quiet, too steady, the kind of man who bent iron but never broke rules. Yet here he stood, hammer dripping, eyes burning like embers dug straight from hell. Brant's voice caught in his throat. What have you done?" Perspective, Nathaniel. The words barely reached him. His ears still rang with the echoes of iron striking flesh. He did not see Brant's whip, or the lantern light, or even Clara trembling beside him. He saw only the years of humiliation carved into scars on his back. "I've done," he said, his voice low but steady. "What should have been done long ago." The overseer's jaw tightened. For a heartbeat, Nathaniel thought Brant might lash the whip, raise alarm, call the others. But fear shimmered in the man's eyes. Fear not of rebellion, but of truth. Truth that a single slave had toppled 3 masters with nothing but his own hands. Perspective, Clara. Her throat was dry as dust. She wanted to scream, to beg, to pray. But all she could do was cling to Nathaniel's sleeve as Brant's lantern wavered. The overseer stepped backward slowly, eyes darting between the corpses and the hammer. He muttered something, maybe a curse, maybe a prayer. Then he turned and stumbled into the night. Clara's heart nearly burst. "He'll bring them," she whispered frantically. "The others, the hounds, the riders. Nathaniel, we have to go." But her brother's gaze followed the overseer into the dark. He did not move. Perspective, Nathaniel. Running had never been his way. His life had been one long run already. Run from the lash, run from hunger, run from memory. Tonight, for the first time, he was standing. "Go if you must," he said to Clara, voice heavy as iron. "But I won't." Her eyes widened with terror. "You'll die here." Nathaniel's grip tightened on the hammer. "Better standing than crawling." Perspective, Clara. The weight of his words crushed her chest. She wanted to drag him, to pull him into the woods, to save him from himself. But her hands trembled too much, her knees too weak. She could hear dogs barking now, distant but closer with every heartbeat. The plantation was waking. Lanterns flickered outside. Voices shouted. The overseer's warning had already spread. Clara looked at her brother one last time. His face was set like stone, shadowed by the dim light, blood smeared across his chest and arms. She saw not just Nathaniel, but every story whispered in the quarters of men who dreamed of fighting back, who never lived to tell it. "Then I'll stay," she whispered, though her voice cracked with fear. Nathaniel's hand brushed hers for the briefest second, rough palm against trembling fingers. It was not comfort, it was farewell. Perspective, Nathaniel. Boots thundered outside. Shadows moved against the lantern light. The sound of rifles being cocked cut through the air. Nathaniel lifted the hammer again, his chest steady now, his eyes fixed on the doors. He could hear Clara's ragged breathing beside him, but his own was calm. For once he felt no chain, no fear, no master above him. If they wanted him, they would have to take him by force. The doors burst open, and the night became fire. What happens when the weight of centuries of chains collides with the barrels of guns? In the stable at Briarwood, fire met powder, and one blacksmith carried the voice of the voiceless in his hammer. Perspective, Nathaniel. The doors slammed wide, lantern light flooding in. Half a dozen armed men stormed the stable, muskets raised, pistols drawn, dogs snapping at their leashes. Overseer Brant stood behind them, his face pale, pointing with a trembling hand. "There," he shouted. "He's killed them all." The men rushed forward, boots crunching straw, rifles leveled. Nathaniel tightened his grip on the hammer. His heart did not race. His breath was not frantic. He felt a calmness he had never known. If this was to be his last night, it would be one where he stood as a man, not bent as a slave. "You think you can stop me with chains?" he said, his voice booming over the clamor. "Chains been breaking all night." The dogs lunged. Nathaniel swung, the hammer crushing one mid-air, sending the other yelping back. The overseer cursed. The armed men hesitated. Fear flickered in their eyes. They had come expecting a cowering slave, not a storm with flesh and bone. Perspective, Clara. Clara pressed herself against the stable wall, her heart rattling like a drum. Gun barrels glinted in the lantern light. Her brother stood in the center, soaked in sweat and blood, hammer raised high like some figure carved from stone and fire. "Don't shoot," Brant barked. "We need him alive." But fear broke discipline. A musket cracked, the shot tearing into Nathaniel's side. He staggered but did not fall. Blood soaked his shirt, but his arm swung again, striking one of the men square in the chest. The soldier crumpled, ribs shattering like kindling. Clara screamed. She wanted to run to him, to shield him, but her legs would not obey. She clutched the beam, nails digging into wood until splinters pierced her skin. Perspective, one of the militiamen. His name was Thomas Pike, a farmer's son called in to defend the Wallace estate. He had never feared slaves before. They bent, they obeyed, they cried beneath the lash. But the man before him, bloodied, eyes blazing, was no slave. Pike's hands shook as he tried to reload. He saw Edward Wallace's body lying twisted in the hay. Charles sprawled, Henry's skull smashed like rotten fruit. He thought of his own master's cruelty, the way he'd whipped an old woman for dropping a pail. For the first time, Pike wondered, what if they all rose up like this one? Fear turned his stomach. He raised his rifle again. Perspective, Nathaniel. Another shot rang out. Fire tore through his shoulder. Pain screamed in his veins, but the hammer did not drop. He swung wide, the blow connecting with Pike's jaw, sending him crashing against the stall. The others shouted, some firing, some backing away. The stable filled with smoke, screams, and the acrid stench of gunpowder. Horses broke loose, charging into the night. Nathaniel's vision blurred, his body weakened, blood pouring from wounds. But still he fought, each strike fueled by every lash he had endured. Every night his people whispered prayers no God seemed to hear. He was not just himself now. He was his mother, his father, Clara, every name lost in ledgers, every life buried unmarked. His hammer fell again and again until his arms trembled with exhaustion. Perspective, Clara. She saw it. The moment his body faltered, Nathaniel sank to one knee, his breaths ragged, the hammer slick with his own blood. Rifles aimed steady now, soldiers no longer trembling. "Drop it," one shouted. "Drop the damn hammer." Clara's scream tore the air. "Don't, Nathaniel, don't." But he only turned his head toward her, eyes steady, lips curved in the faintest smile, a smile that told her he was no longer theirs. He raised the hammer one final time. Shots exploded. The hammer slipped from his hand as his body collapsed into the straw, blood pooling beneath him. Perspective, Overseer Brant. Brant stepped forward, whip dangling useless at his side. He stared down at the blacksmith's body. Even in death, the man's face looked unbroken, as if the grave itself could not chain him. Brant felt a chill crawl up his spine. The Wallace cousins lay dead, their heir butchered by the very man they had owned. And around them, the air felt heavy, thick with something he could not name. It was not just blood, it was reckoning. Perspective, Clara. Clara fell to her knees beside her brother, sobs tearing her chest. She pressed her hands to his wounds, though she knew it was useless. His blood soaked her dress, warm and unyielding. "Nathaniel," she whispered, shaking him. "Please." But his eyes were already closed, his breath gone. Outside, the quarters had stirred. Dozens of enslaved men and women stood in the distance, silent, watching the lantern light flicker against the stable. They saw the bodies of the masters. They saw Nathaniel lying in crimson. They did not cry out. They only watched, their silence heavier than any sermon, for in that silence lived a truth. One man had risen, and though his body lay broken, his defiance would not die with him. Final perspective, the quarters. Word would spread before dawn. Some would call it savagery, others madness. But among the enslaved, whispers would carry his name like a hymn. The blacksmith who broke chains not with escape, but with fire and iron. The system still stood, the whips would still crack. But for one night, Briarwood burned with memory, and in that memory, Nathaniel's hammer would never be silent again. They buried his body, but not his fire. On the fields of Georgia, chains still rattled, but the name of the blacksmith began to rattle louder. Perspective, Clara. They dragged Nathaniel's body from the stable before dawn. Clara had clung to him until their whips tore her away. She screamed, clawed, begged, but her brother's bloodied chest no longer rose. They left him in the dirt like refuse. 3 white masters beside him, their fine clothes soaked and ruined. By sunrise, the plantation was silent. The laughter of the Wallaces, once as common as the crack of whips, was gone. Clara sat in the quarters, wrists raw from rope, staring at the floor. The women whispered around her, some weeping, some trembling, some staring with hollow eyes. One of the old men, Elijah, leaned close and whispered, "Child, your brother, he did what we all dream and fear. Don't let them make you ashamed." But Clara could not speak. She could still feel his calloused hand brushing hers in the stable, his final smile as the rifles roared. That image burned hotter than grief. It was not the look of a broken man. It was freedom, even as life left him. Perspective. Overseer Brant. Brant stood at the edge of the shallow grave the next day, watching as Nathaniel's body was lowered in without ceremony. No prayers, no marker, just dirt shoveled over flesh. The Wallace cousins were carried to town in coffins. Nathaniel was fed to the soil, but Brant could not erase what he had seen in the stable, the way a single man had stood against guns and whips, hammer in hand striking like thunder. He had lived among slaves his whole life, treating them as shadows, property, beasts. Yet when Nathaniel stood, he did not look like property. He looked like judgment. Brant spat into the dirt, but the taste in his mouth was ash. He told himself the rebellion was over, that order would return, that the Wallace's death would serve as warning. But deep in his chest, fear gnawed at him. If one could do this, what if others followed? What if the hammer was only the first strike? Perspective. The quarter. That night, when the overseers retreated to the big house, the quarters stirred with a quiet more dangerous than any shout. They gathered in the shadows, huddled by the dying fire. No one dared speak his name aloud, but their eyes carried it. A young boy asked, "Why'd he do it?" An elder woman, her back bent from years in the cane, answered softly, "Because he was tired of bowing, because they touched what was his blood, because sometimes a man got to die to show the rest what livin' means." The boy nodded slowly, as if tucking the words into his bones. Around him, others murmured prayers, not to the master's God, but to the ancestors who knew chains and fire. They said Nathaniel's spirit would not rest in the shallow grave. It would walk the fields, hammer in hand, guarding the living, reminding them that fear was not the only inheritance. Perspective. Clara. Weeks passed. Overseers worked harder to crush spirits. The lash sang more often. Dogs patrolled at night. Yet Clara noticed something shift. The people in the quarters stood straighter, their eyes sharper. Whispers passed like sparks in the dark. Children mimicked swinging hammers when they thought no one watched. Old men hummed work songs with new weight. Women, bent over washtubs, spoke of storms that would come. Storms carried not by clouds but by hands like Nathaniel's. Clara carried her brother's fire in silence. Every time she drew water from the well, she remembered how he once carried her on his shoulders. Every time she heard the ring of a hammer striking metal, she felt his presence beside her. She did not cry anymore. Tears belonged to despair. She had something else now. Memory sharpened into resolve. Perspective. The land. The plantation kept turning. Cotton was picked. Bales loaded. Coins exchanged. The system did not crumble that night. But in the soil, something had changed. The blood of the Wallaces stained the straw of the stable. The blood of Nathaniel soaked the earth beneath the shallow grave. Those stains could not be scrubbed out. They lived in the land, whispering through the rustle of cane, echoing in the strike of every hammer that followed. White men spoke of it as savagery, madness, a cautionary tale. But among the enslaved, it was spoken of in secret as truth. A man had stood. A man had struck back. A man had proven that even the strongest chains could not silence the fire of the forge forever. Final chorus. Memory. Generations later, when the system of slavery was broken by war, whispers of Nathaniel's night still lingered in Georgia. Some called it a massacre, others called it justice. But in the stories told quietly, by firelight, to children who never knew chains, he was not a criminal. He was the blacksmith who turned iron into reckoning, who lifted the hammer for every voice that had been buried in silence. And though his body rotted in an unmarked grave, his defiance lived on, striking again and again in memory. each swing a reminder that no system, no whip, no master could truly hold a soul that chose to rise,